Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Dr. Mohammad Sahimi about the history of modern Iran. Dr. Sahimi is a professor of chemical engineering and material science and holds the NIOC chair in petroleum engineering at USC, and was the former political columnist for the Tehran Bureau. He has written extensively about Iranian politics and the Iranian nuclear program for many years, and his articles have been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous other prominent publications. You can follow his work at his website, www.imenews.com, and on Facebook at Mohammad Sahimi. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Iran-history. Dr. Sahimi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me in your show.
Let's start off by talking about the Shah system. What is it and what does it look like?
Well, according to the constitution that Iranians had after the constitutional revolution of 1906, the Shah was supposed to be a ceremonial figure, be a monarch like what we have in Britain and other Western European countries, and the actual powers should rest in the hands of prime minister and his government that would be elected directly by the people. But that's not what happened. Between 1941 and 1953, when the Shah was Iranian king after the Allied forces invaded Iran in 1941, he was more or less a ceremonial figure, but he gradually began changing the constitution. And then when the CIA staged a coup in 1953, he transformed his rule and himself into absolute monarch and absolute dictatorship in Iran. So everything would go through him. Elections became meaningless. The results of the election were known before people even voted. All the political parties were banned. All the independent newspapers were shut down, and all freedom of expression, freedom of thoughts, and everything else was quashed. And therefore, Iran became a complete dictatorship under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi from CIA coup of 1953 until the Islamic Revolution of 1979.
All right, so let's go back to that 53 coup. I guess Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh's nationalization of Iran's oil and petroleum industry was a factor in bringing about that British-American coup. But can you talk a little bit more about what led to that coup and how that coup is viewed today?
Well, Dr. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil industry in 1951 and tried to negotiate with the British government and the Anglo-American oil company that was running Iran oil industry at that time. A lot of people in the West think that the negotiations and the reason that Dr. Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry was over Iran demanding more of the oil income that was being made at that time. But that was actually not true. What Dr. Mossadegh wanted at that time was Iran complete control over its oil industry and oil resources. And that was not acceptable to the British government and the Anglo-American oil company. And at the same time, the Eisenhower administration came to power in early 1953, and the British government persuaded the Eisenhower administration that Dr. Mossadegh and his government were a threat to national security of the United States and Britain. They also claimed that if Mossadegh continues with his government and his rule, eventually Iran would fall in the hands of the Soviet Union, because at that time Iran had a communist party known in Iran as the Tudeh party that was loyal to Moscow and the Soviet Union. So the claim was that the Tudeh party will eventually overthrow Dr. Mossadegh, and Iran becomes another satellite of the old Soviet Union, which was, of course, not true. This Tudeh party, the Communist Party, was not in any position to do that, and it wasn't powerful enough to do that. But that was enough for the Eisenhower administration and the British government, and therefore they staged a coup in August of 1953. They first tried on August 16, 1953. That failed simply because people who supported Dr. Mossadegh came out on the street and prevented the coup from succeeding. The U.S. almost set aside the plan for the coup, but was persuaded again to try once again, and this time on August 19, 1953, 3 days later, they staged a coup again, and because Dr. Mossadegh also made a mistake by asking people to stay at home and not to come out in his support, and because of the fact that some elements in the Iranian army supported the coup, and one of the leading clerics at that time also had withdrawn his support from Dr. Mossadegh, the coup this time succeeded, and Dr. Mossadegh was arrested and his government was toppled, and the Shah, who had fled Iran a while earlier, returned to Iran, and the monarchy was restored, and the Shah, as I said, gradually transformed himself and his rule to an absolute dictatorship that was finally overthrown in February of 1979.
So let's talk a little bit about that 1979 revolution. Tell us a bit more about what some of the causes were, and perhaps a little bit about how the spike in oil prices in 73 may have had some of an impact.
Well, the oil boom of 1973 brought significant income into Iran. And therefore, the Shah decided to undertake an ambitious plan of modernization of Iran. Except that the plan that he put in place through his government wasn't working. So instead of economic development, we had high inflation and problems associated with it. At the same time, the Shah government was utterly corrupt, and a lot of resources being wasted. And at the same time, the economic gap between a small percentage of the population that were supporting the Shah and the rest of the population was widening. These, together with the fact that there was no political freedom for the people, became the foundation for the 1979 revolution. 1970s, when I was attending Tehran University, was probably the most turbulent decade before the revolution, because it was at the height of opposition to the Shah's rule for a variety of factors that I mentioned. At the same time, the great mistake that the Shah made was that he banned all the nationalist, secular parties, leftist parties, and so on, and he threw their leaders in jail and even executed some of them, while at the same time the clerics had relative freedom in Iran to carry out the program and what they were trying to do. Ayatollah Khomeini at that time was in exile in Iraq, and through the vast network of mosques that he had in Iran and his disciples and former students, he was sending his message to the Iranian population. So dissatisfaction with the Shah's rule, the great economical difficulty that the modernization program had created, and absolute lack of political freedom, all came together and became the engine for Iranian revolution of 1978, 1979. In 1978, in January of 1978, there was an article published in one of the government-controlled newspapers in which the author insulted Ayatollah Khomeini greatly and used a variety of profanities against him. That provoked demonstrations in the holy city of Qom just a few days later, during which the demonstrators confronted security forces and several people got killed. Then, according to Shiite Islam, on the 40th day of somebody passing away or being killed, they have a ceremony for him, and therefore 40 days after the demonstration in Qom, there are demonstrations in Tabriz, in another important city in Iran. That also led to confrontation between demonstrators and security forces. Again, some people killed, and gradually this become basically a tradition of mourning the death after 40 days, and spread throughout Iran. At the beginning, when these demonstrations started, the Shah didn't realize the depth of dissatisfaction that existed among Iranian people at that time, and therefore he thought that he could easily control it and get rid of the demonstrators. But that's not what happened. As I said, difficult economic conditions, together with lack of political power, together with the fact that the Shah did not allow any of the secular opposition to be active, provided the right background for the clerics and the religious forces to take over the revolution. So by late summer of 1978, the revolution had gathered a lot of steam. The Shah had sacked his prime minister and appointed someone else, one of his lackeys, but he also couldn't do anything. Then the Shah put in power a military government and jailed a lot of leaders of the demonstrators. That didn't work also. And gradually it became clear that the revolution was going to topple the Shah. The Shah tried to reach a compromise with the opposition, the same opposition that he had jailed for many, many years, and he had prevented them from political activity. But the opposition mostly refused. So eventually he was forced to leave Iran in early January of 1979. A few days after he left, Ayatollah Khomeini, who at that time was in exile in a suburb of Paris, returned to Iran. And 10 days after Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran, the last government of the Shah, that was headed by Dr. Shapur Bakhtiar, who belonged to Iran National Front but had separated from National Front and had agreed to form the last government of the Shah, was toppled, and the Iranian army announced that they are neutral in the confrontation between the state and the people. And that's how the Shah was toppled and his regime was gone and Islamic Republic was born.
So give us a little bit of background for our readers who don't know. Who is Ayatollah Khomeini, and what is his history, and what was his message?
Well, Ayatollah Khomeini was one of the clerics that always believed that clerics should rule Iran. He believed in role of religious in politics, and he did not believe in separation of church and state or mosque and the government. As early as 1963, he led an uprising against the Shah in June of 1963, after the Shah had signed an agreement with the United States, according to which if U.S. advisors in Iran had committed any crime, they could not be put on trial in Iran, which in Iran is referred to as capitulation. So Khomeini used that as an excuse to start an uprising, and there was an uprising on June 5, 1963, and a lot of people were killed. Ayatollah Khomeini was arrested and first exiled to Turkey, and from there he went to Iraq. Ayatollah Khomeini had a book written in that era in which he had described how he intended, if he ever came to power, how he intended to set up a theocracy in Iran and rule through Islam. But when the revolution started in 1978, a lot of people were not aware of his thinking about mixing of religion and governance. And at the same time, when he moved from Iraq to suburb of Paris in fall of 1978 to lead the revolution from there, he was making all sorts of promises to revolutionary forces that if they toppled the Shah and set up a new system of government in Iran, everybody would be free to express his or her opinion. Political parties would be free. The press would be free, and so on and so forth. So in the vacuum of leadership that the Shah had generated by banning all the secular parties from leftists to nationalists, and the fact that religious people were the best organized in Iran at that time, just like, for example, when we have Arab Springs in Egypt in 2011, and the religious groups were the best organized. In the vacuum of leadership that the Shah had generated, the religious people took over the leadership of the revolution. And because Ayatollah Khomeini had a reputation for being uncorrupted and being very humble in terms of his personal lifestyle and so on, and because he was known since 1960s to politically active people as one of the main figures of opposition against the Shah, he gradually became the undisputed leader of revolution. But after he came to power and the Islamic Republic was founded, a lot of promises that he made were basically forgotten. Instead of a truly secular republican system that most people had envisioned for Iran after the Shah, he and his lieutenant drafted a constitution and then put it to a referendum. And because a lot of people didn't know at that time, the referendum passed, but the referendum basically allowed the establishment of the current theocracy in Iran, and therefore he became the supreme leader of Iran, even though Iran has an elected president and an elected parliament and so on. Now, as long as he was the supreme leader, the mixing of religion and governance were more or less smooth because of the fact that he has such indisputed authority and charisma, and a lot of people, despite a lot of promises that he had made and hadn't delivered, were still more or less respecting him. It didn't cause a lot of problems for Iran. But after he passed away in 1989, and the constitution was also revised and gave more power to the supreme leader and less power to the president, then the problems with mixing of religion and governance began to amplify and get Iran to the stage that it is now, where the supreme leader has a lot of power, the president has limited power. The president still has influence. It can do a lot of good things if he wants to, but the ultimate power still rests in the hands of the supreme leader, and that has generated a lot of unhappiness and dissatisfaction in Iran that has manifested itself throughout the years through university student uprising, the Green Movement of 2009, and similar events over the past 25 years since Ayatollah Ali Khamenei rose to become supreme leader of Iran in June of 1989.
So very quickly, before we look at a few more events in the post-1979 period, I just want to go back. Can you talk about, under the Shah's rule, the secret police, what they were like, and also the closeness of Iranian and American relations during that time?
Oh, yes. The secret police of the Shah, that was known by its Iranian acronyms, the Camac, was founded in 1957 with the help of the CIA and the Israeli Mossad. It was supposed to be basically an internal security apparatus, but after the uprising of June 1963 that I mentioned, the Camac became basically an instrument of arresting the political activists, putting in jail, torturing them, and even executing them. A lot of them, hundreds of them at least, were executed during that period. And all of this was being done in cooperation and help of Israel and the United States. So Camac became a totally feared organization in Iran in the 1960s and 1970s. A lot of, for example, university student activists were arrested by the Camac and went to jail. And there were two opposition groups that were fighting the Shah through an armed struggle. One was a secular leftist organization, and one was a Islamic leftist organization, which is now called the MEK or Mujahideen. A lot of their members were arrested, a lot of them were executed, a lot of them were tortured, and some of them died under torture while they've been tortured. And during this whole time, the United States was aware of the violation of human rights in Iran. But because the Shah and his government were a strategic ally of the United States, particularly during the presidency of Richard Nixon and his national security advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the United States really didn't pay any attention to violation of human rights, lack of political freedom in Iran, and problems like that. Then worst came to worst in early March of 1979. The Shah banned all political parties, although those political parties were not really meaningful political parties, but he didn't even tolerate that, and he banned all of them, and he ordered Iran to become a single-party state where all his loyal supporters were supposed to be active within that single-party system. And again, the Shah the United States that has very close military and economic relation with the Shah and his government didn't pay any attention. The Shah bought billions of dollars of worth of weapons from the United States. President Nixon basically had told the Shah that he could have any weapon that he wanted as long as he acts as the security agent of the United States in the Persian Gulf. The Shah sent its army to Oman in south of Persian Gulf, where there was a leftist insurgency. The Shah also cooperated with the United States after a leftist government came to power in Afghanistan, and both the Shah and the United States tried to prop up Islamic fundamentalist groups in order to be active in Afghanistan and eventually overthrow the leftist government in Afghanistan that was supported by the Soviet Union. So during this time, the Shah enjoyed complete support and confidence of the United States, while the United States did not pay any attention to a state of political freedom in Iran, freedom of expression, freedom of press, and so on and so forth. And in fact, what had happened was the United States relied on the Camac, the security apparatus, for information about the state of affairs in Iran. And in fact, in 1976, only 2 years before Iranian Revolution, the CIA published a report that said that Iran is not even in a pre-revolutionary state, let alone a revolutionary state. But by then, everybody knew that the Shah's government was in deep trouble, and economic problems that had been caused by too rapid economic development and corruption of the Shah, together with lack of political freedom and other aspects of political freedom, meant that the Shah was in deep trouble. Even in 1978, when the demonstrations started, Zbigniew Brzezinski, national security advisor of President Jimmy Carter, urged the Shah to show an iron fist and put down the demonstrators, and then think about perhaps reform at a later time. Another thing that contributed to the hostility between Iran and the United States, between revolutionaries and the United States, was the fact that President Jimmy Carter spent the New Year's Eve of 1978 in Tehran, during which he gave a speech and declared that Iran under the Shah leadership was an island of stability. And that basically encouraged the Shah, because the Shah was concerned about all the things that President Carter was saying about respect for human rights. But when President Carter gave that speech in Shah's palace on the New Year's Eve of 1978, this was basically interpreted by the Shah that he had as free a hand as he had during the Ford and Nixon administration and early administrations to do what he wants. So it was just 2 weeks after President Carter's visit to Tehran that that insulting article against Ayatollah Khomeini was published in one of the government-controlled newspapers that basically acted as a spark for the Iranian Revolution and led to the toppling of the Shah about a year later.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.